Welcome everybody to the video for Chapter 8, Section 4, Learning and Culture Flourish. So one of the big themes of this chapter is the changes in Europe that took place from the Dark Ages to the later Middle Ages. During the Dark Ages, you had very little learning and cultural achievement. Now, by the late Middle Ages, a new cultural awakening is emerging throughout Europe. One of the things we associate with cultural achievement is learning. There wasn't a lot of that going on in the Dark Ages, but by the late Middle Ages, we're going to start to see universities emerge. Let me get me out of the way so you can see this guy. He looks pretty important, walking around with something, whatever that thing is. Put me up here because we're going to have some other pictures. There we go. So as economic conditions improved and warfare started to decrease, this eventually is going to lead to a need for more educated people. There we go. You didn't need to be educated to be a warrior, but now kings are creating more complex governments for themselves. They need advisors instead of just warriors. They need ministers, and they need to be literate, these people. Also, similar to what we discussed in ancient China, education was now becoming a way to improve your standing. Also, the church wanted better educated clergy. You see on the right side of the table here, you see some high-ranking clergy members. They felt it gave them even more status within society. Getting an education wasn't easy, though. Student life was pretty strict. University students typically attended classes from sunrise to sunset, in addition to the prayers. Also, since this was before the invention of the printing press, books were still not plentiful, so students had to memorize everything. You see this one picture here. The teacher, the professor, he's got the main book, and then there's one book for the rest of them. So once you got your hands on it, you had to memorize it because it had to be passed around to everybody. They were also tested in oral exams that could last for hours. So very, very different from our modern concept of schooling. Also, higher education was only for men. Women could not go to university. Some women of upper class families might be educated through private tutors, and some nuns might be educated in convents, but women were barred from getting university degrees, so therefore they couldn't be doctors, lawyers, or church officials. Overall, women, like the ones you see in the picture, were expected to stick to the traditional roles of women: sewing, cooking, caring for the family, stuff like that. Now, a big reason why there was an expansion of universities was because of the expansion of what we call new learning. Now, remember in the last video how I talked about how many of the ideas being circulated around Europe were new to them, but not new to the world, hence why new is put in quotation marks. So this new learning was mostly Greek. It was from the works of the philosophers. Get me out of the way again. Those Greek philosophers we learned about back in chapter 4, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Now, this stuff had been lost to Europeans after the fall of Rome, but it had been preserved in the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East. Trade and the Crusades brought these works back to Europe. Now, as these ideas circulated through Europe, though, they brought some problems with them. You see, Greek logic was a bit of a problem with Christian scholars. Philosophers like Aristotle said you should use reason or logic to figure out what was true. Christianity said that truth should be based on faith. So when you combine the two, it appears that you got a bit of a problem. This apparent contradiction, though, was resolved by some Christian scholars, and the method they called this was called scholasticism. And in scholasticism, they used reason to support Christian beliefs. And the most famous of these Christian scholars was St. Thomas Aquinas. Really moving me all over the place here. A lot of pictures. You see the quote there: faith is not opposed to reason, but it is higher than reason. So he very clearly set forth, he goes, I am a religious individual. He was a man of the cloth, so he was going to put faith ahead. But he said they don't need to be in constant conflict with each other. Both lead to the same truth, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, that God rules over an orderly universe. Now, let's take a look at medieval literature. This is still before the printing press, so literacy rates are still pretty low, but you did start to see some increase. And one of the effects of this increase in learning and literacy was that more writing was done now in the vernacular. Vernacular means the ordinary language of everyday people. Latin remained the official language of the church and the language of scholars, but at this time you start to see books being written in English, French, German, all the local languages. A popular type of literature of this time was the heroic epic. Like the epic poems of the ancient world, like the story of Gilgamesh and the Trojan War, stories about heroes and warriors were very popular. But now instead of heroes of ancient Mesopotamia and Greece, you had medieval heroes like the Song of Roland, right? You see the illustration up there. And that was an epic poem of one of Charlemagne's knights who embodied the code of chivalry. A different type of epic was Dante's Inferno. Let me move over here. There we go. Written in the 1300s by the Italian poet Dante Alighieri, the poem takes a reader on a journey through the different levels of hell. There we go. So you see them actually listed here kind of in table format. So there are 9 layers of hell, and what they talk about over here on the right-hand column are all the people that would go into it. Now, we'll actually discuss this a bit more in class, so if you're having difficulty reading through it from the screen, don't worry about it. And then in this picture over here on the right, it gives you a little bit more of a illustration of it. Okay, the 9 circles of hell. So Dante, who is both the narrator and the main character, he vividly describes the people in punishments as he travels through all these different circles of hell. The story, it summarizes Christian ethics. It shows how people's actions in life determines their fates in the afterlife. And one other popular story was Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, Chaucer was an English writer, although this was Old English, which would seem like almost a different language to modern English. And his story is of a group of travelers on a religious pilgrimage, and it's a detailed look into everyday life in the Middle Ages. Now, last thing for this section is architecture. Really moving me all over the place here, but now, most of the architecture we associated with this time period was for churches and cathedrals. The first style we're going to look at was called Romanesque style of architecture. Now, these churches were designed for protection. You look at the pictures of them right there. I'll get to the second point in a second. This style was popular around the year 1000, and it was still a pretty violent time around the year 1000. So churches needed to protect themselves from looters and vandals. It was also made with heavy walls to support the towers. So you had very thin windows. You didn't have a lot of windows, actually. And because of this, the interior was pretty dark and gloomy. Now, around the 1200s, a new style emerges known as Gothic style. Gothic was all about going bigger. It was meant to be taller and larger than Romanesque. Actually, I can leave it here. You guys get the idea. This is a picture of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. There was a horrible fire there just recently, so unfortunately it looks a lot different now. But in its heyday, that's what it looked like. And you see the people in front of it to give you a sense of scale for how big it is. Very, very different from those fairly simple churches that I just showed you before. In order to support these larger buildings, though, architects had to develop some different features. One of them was this thing called flying buttresses. Now, flying buttresses were designed to support the walls. You see, this picture is from one of the side views of Notre Dame. So the flying buttresses would be these things here. You see how they're almost kind of like arms that come up, and as they connect to the side of it, it gives it better support. Right, so you didn't have to kind of pile these heavy rocks on top of each other to prevent it from falling over. This allowed the walls to be thinner, and it also allowed for large spaces of stained glass windows. Now, these stained glass windows were magnificent works of art. I'll show you a blown up version of it. This is that center stained glass window piece from Notre Dame. And you see the colors, the amount of intricate details, the pictures in every single one. Really very, very impressive. I also want to show you guys a couple of pictures of the interior of some Gothic cathedrals just to show you the sense of scale, size for how big these things were. Very, very different, right? They were meant to illuminate. They were meant to impress. You see the use of archways that also allowed them to build bigger. So you're starting to see some taking of the old architectural styles of Rome in particular, but adding to them and developing in new progressive ways as well. All right, so that wraps things up for talking about culture and learning in the Middle Ages, and then we're going to finish up with this chapter in the next video, section 5, and talk about some not so good things that were happening in the late Middle Ages.